Well, I came here for the first time in '94.
Yeah.
It's unrecognizable.
Yeah.
Unrecognizable. The city is like so much like more developed now.
Castle Golfo, San Francisco, it's fun. The nature, the beach.
Between the bridge, the cable cars, the hills, sometimes the fog, it does feel very reminiscent of San Francisco. Actually, the bridge was built by the same company.
Yeah, I was googling that. It's the same paint, it's everything, so it's not fully coincidental that it looks the same.
No.
How was your trip?
Good. 5-hour plus editing session. Hopefully it was good. It was fun.
Hi. How are you?
Hi. Nice to meet you.
So Jeferson Valadares. I'm originally from Brazil, but I've been around. So I started my own games company in Brazil in 2000, and then in 2005 I moved to Helsinki. Lived there a couple of years, and then London, a few years, San Francisco, like a bunch of years. And then about 5 years ago, I decided to start a company again, and I moved to Portugal because I thought this was a good place to do it. So I'm here in Lisbon now. Started as make programming, game design, and then eventually started running the company, and then production, studio management roles. I was also head of mobile for a while for Bandai Namco, but mostly I would say game development, production, studio management roles.
Okay.
I mean, I started again a little over 20 years ago. Like at that time, I don't think you even realized in Brazil that was possible to go make games. So I think at some point, I just had another startup doing web publishing, which is this was 1999. It was an amazing time for web publishing. But then I realized it didn't give me any pleasure to do it. The challenges of a startup were fun, but the product itself wasn't exciting. And startup is hard. Like you don't want to be doing it unless you really like what you're doing.
Yeah.
And then some other friends later said, oh, maybe you should start a games company. I'm like, yeah, why not? We started, we put a pitch together. We went to an investor. This was early 2000. And, we had a term sheet. We're like, oh, already, we're going to get money. And then NASDAQ crash. The investors never called again. These 100% disappeared. So, it's like the world has been going through these kind of stages over and over. But it's, I started literally because, I wanted to do it and there was no job. So I had to start a company. I'm very fond of a game that we made when I was in Helsinki, when I was at Digital Chocolate. We made a game called Tornado Mania, which was the first time IGN gave a 10 to a mobile game.
Nice.
I mean, this is before the iPhone, right? So we all thought mobile was going to be the next thing, but it was never getting there. So we were all frustrated. But to be able to make a game and see a place like IGN recognize it with a 10, it was okay, we're doing our part. Games are not necessarily the easiest career and not the most you're probably not going to make the most money just out of the salary directly, right? As when you're talking about Playfish, when we were there in London, we hired our server guys from banks, and they made way more money than we're offering. But they came because first they didn't have to wear a suit, and then second people are just cool in the office. It wasn't a bunch of finance people, and then. So I think there's a little bit of the trade-off there, right? So we want to be fair, but I definitely see there's an element of if there's certain things you want in life, there's probably better ways to get them than make games.
I think a lot of the craziness in games right now is being driven by the fact that there's so much more VC money in it now, and VCs are fickle. They see the next shiny object, and then that's the only thing that matters. But the problem is that it changes every year. So if you have a company that has to change the VC money, it's really hard to have a long-term strategy because now you need to pivot from your metaverse strategy to your AI strategy because otherwise the funding's not going to be there.
Yeah, that's right. So I think that's one of the things that made me a little frustrated with the working with big American corporations. They're always in this quarterly because of the financials, right? They're public listed, so they have to be worrying about stocks. So they're always looking at the short term. I had so many conversations about hey, can you build a team for this? And I can say yes. It's going to take 2 years, and they're no problem. Yeah. And then 8 months later, they're is it done yet? And I'm like, no. Remember we said 2 years.
We had this discussion.
So this happens, right? So it's frustrating. That's actually why I went to work for a Japanese company, because they're more long-term thinking.
Yeah,
So, I
yeah.
had when I was at Bandana, they gave me a 3-year program, and I spent there the 3 years. It was like, as we agreed, right? So I think it is possible to think a little bit more long-term. And that's kind of what we're trying to do here.
Okay.
But it does, like, the funding does determine what you're saying, right?
Yeah,
Because if you can't, I mean, eventually you need money, and then if you're not being successful, like if you're not generating the money, you need to get it from somewhere, and what you get from definitely affects the dynamics.
Yeah, yeah. Most of your career you've been in Europe, right?
Yeah, I would say it's like probably half here and half in the US. But the reason why I moved back to Europe and decided to start my company here is like I actually prefer like how it's here, which is a little bit less about like who's paying me more and and it's more about like can we do this? Can we keep doing it? Can we do it like this in the right way?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, it's still difficult in both ways, right? And I'm not saying that the US is better like or worse. Like I think I absolutely love my experience there, and I recommend to everybody to work there because they are really all about the work. So I think it's good to see that. But personally, I think the balance that Europe has is better.
Yeah.
For me, like Portugal made sense because I think there's some tech stuff, sure. But also, like, the bureaucracy here is not as bad as Germany.
Yeah.
Maybe not as good as the UK, but, it's... So, I mean, here I think is a little bit middle of the road. It's not the best, not the worst. But it's also, like, potential. Like, like Berlin is already a big scene, right? Like, I mean, it's growing, but, like, I think
It's complicated, but it's getting there. Right.
Yeah, definitely more years of like big companies there, right? And I think Stockholm, Helsinki, all those places have like big players. And I thought here was like it's a place to invest. So I wouldn't necessarily come here if I wanted to make a PlayStation 5 game that needed like 400 people. But I think if you're making something different, which I was doing at the time, something innovative, I think if you're gonna get people off college, this is a really good place. Like they speak really good English, which is not a given, in all of Europe. Culturally, they're very aligned, which is not a given again, like versus Eastern Europe. Time zone is the same as London.
Yeah.
I mean, there's direct flights to everywhere. There's direct flights to San Francisco. So I just felt like, okay, there's enough conditions here that makes sense for me. So I moved. I do some side activities, right? So like when I was in Brazil, I started the Brazilian Developers Association. Currently, I'm the president of the Portuguese one.
Yeah.
And the reason why I do this is not because I have copious amounts of free time. The reason why I do this is because I don't want people to have to suffer the same things I did, right? So like I spend a lot of my time trying to like give feedback. Yeah. People ask for my advice, I always give it. Advice on how to handle funding, how to handle like this did not exist at my time. Like there's nobody who could help.
What are the kind of real obstacles? What are the real opportunities that the games industry is facing right now?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some amount of like maturity kind of coming on, because you said like one of the things that changed, right? The things that change is like the new generation, they don't even question like if somebody's a gamer or not, right? Like everybody is. Like I think there's so it kind of becomes part of the furniture, right? So I think that is a thing, because for a whole career, the game was always growing, and now it's probably unlikely to kind of just grow because it literally has everybody, right? Like everybody's playing. But I mean, business models are always changing, like tech is always changing. Mobile, like who again was a thing that we all dreamt it was going to be amazing in the early 2000s, and then eventually became amazing in the 2010s, and now we're in the 2020s thinking like it's doomed, but I mean it's really not, right? I think it's just like everybody has it, so it's not as easy. And a lot of people who get there first, they don't really know games. They're there because there's an opportunity, there's a market disruption, so they get some VC money and they're there. They don't really know what they're doing. They're trying to, and some of them make it, right? You see companies like Zynga, like escaping from being a Facebook company to being like a bigger company today. Well, I guess I'm part of Take-Two now, but like but you see like these companies, like if you really know what you're doing, you can kind of grow. But most people like die out and everything, right? So it's not easy. And I think particularly when a new thing comes, like very few people who know games are actually involved. So it's a lot of like people who are just trying something new, right? Usually it takes a few years until you get the game people going there, and then you can actually see the change. Yeah. So this stuff takes time. I mean, I'm not particularly worried. I think the opportunity, I mean, part of the reason why we started the company is because we thought that service games were not maximized. So I think a lot of people went to go do the new shiny thing, whether that's VR or whatever. But I think there's still a lot of opportunity in service games, right? A lot of the best practices that people use were written in like 10 years ago. Yeah. Like, when Clash of Clans or some other games came out, right? We believe there's still space to do that better. And that's kind of like what we're trying to do before. This is like we're not trying to do the shiniest tech, the prettiest art. What we're trying to do is like, can we make like a really well-designed game that can run for like 10 years? But we start from scratch without trying to get attached to like previous like really spending the time to trying to figure that out. Look at the the games that make for China, look at the Finnish games, look at everything, and trying to figure out like what are the opportunities. So yeah, I mean, you look at the marketing, like IDFA, all this kind of changes. So this actually changes the market. This will require you to find your audience in a different way, and whether that drives people more towards like influencers or towards like building community, which is our approach. Like the two approaches that we do is like building community, and for every game, like really focus on a game that can build community plus like games that can run live service for like a long time. Like those are like the things that we try. This is our approach to what we see is the current market. Phones and the new app stores, that's going to be a big change. Like if people can have different app stores, like that will be like a big change. So I think all those things there's been companies making third-party app stores like for the last 10 years, but maybe now it's their time. Yes, I think there's a lot of opportunities still, but I mean, yeah, if you're just doing, I mean, another positive thing I think we have is like we just started, right? So we started in like middle of 21, so we're kind of 18 months in. We're still growing. We're still like we have the funding, right? So we don't have any revenue, but we're still growing and kind of growing the team. So we were able to build a company for this new world. I think it is problematic. Like if you build a company for the last 10 years and you have all these systems and marketing and all those things, then yeah, obviously it's going to be a bit more of a struggle because you have to change and adapt, right? In our case, we don't have the legacy, so it's easier.
Like summer cabin all year round.
Well, yeah, so that's kind of the thing that this isn't too bad either. Maybe we'll shoot some content in Loviisa and we can do like a comparison shot of my little Shrek hut by a frozen lake and then this and go like, dear viewer, which one would you pick?
My name's Shanti Bergel. I am the founding general partner of a venture fund called Transcend. So we're about 3 years old. I'm based here in Lisbon, Portugal. The fund was started in San Francisco, and we're spread around the world. We invest globally in games and game-related entertainment businesses, usually at the early stage around pre-seed and seed. My background is almost exclusively games. I've been in games for about 30 years. The first half of that, say the first 15, I was a game producer. So I worked on some games you've heard of, like The Sims and FIFA, and a lot that you probably haven't. And then the last 15 were in kind of corporate development, strategy, and investments. So I did investments as an individual, just as an angel, into game companies and tech companies, and as a corporate investor when I was in corporate development, and then culminated in the founding of the fund a couple of years ago. That makes us a little bit unique in the venture world is that all of the folks involved in the fund have some gaming background, most of whom are actually quite deep, like have decades of experience, myself included, like I said, 30 years. So how I ended up in Lisbon is a little bit professional, a little bit personal. I was in London prior to this, and then I was many decades in San Francisco prior to that. So I wanted to be in the EU. The weather doesn't hurt. Lisbon, I think, is an interesting place right now. Portugal has kind of experienced a bit of a renaissance. It's quite small in comparison to some of the other gaming hubs in Europe, but definitely up and coming. And we're hopeful that we'll definitely, be able to leverage the vantage point as well as the local community. I've definitely seen the business grow from, kind of focused on hobbyists when I was a game producer. I made a game for the 3DO. That was my very first.
Yeah.
And back then, we put games on CDs and put them in boxes. And, now it's all online and we have AWS. And there's definitely an evolution that's happened.
Sounds like the Playfish Mafia is kind of assembling here. I mean, we interviewed Jeferson yesterday, and I think he also shares the Playfish background.
Yep. Yeah, so Jeff and I work together at Playfish. But yeah, I mean, the Playfish Mafia, I think, has definitely, made its impact felt around, kind of the gaming industry, including here. But yeah, I don't think there's a call to arms necessarily for all of us to assemble in Lisbon. I'd be happy if that happened. But, I think a lot of people are dug in London and some in San Francisco and some in other kind of European capitals. But, clearly Lisbon has a lot of things going for it. So we'll see. For me, it feels like it has been, a long time coming into its own, and like the Miniclip folks were here early and built up a very significant presence. And then I think the city of Lisbon is now investing in kind of amplifying that. I know that as a tech hub, it's definitely it's the site of Web Summit and things like that. But as a gaming capital, I think it's still kind of that chapter's yet to be written. So I'm hopeful it will be. But like we'll see. I think one of the exciting things about like tech businesses in general and games specifically is that like there's always a bit of creative destruction going on. Like there's maybe not so many things that are in a state of decline at once. I think that's a bit of a unique set of circumstances, although it has happened in prior decades, that like the industry has felt like it's come to a grinding halt. That's not happening now. Like the industry's gotten too big and too diversified for it to kind of completely come to a halt necessarily. But in terms of things that are new and interesting, I think AI, of course, like the impact of AI in gaming is hotly discussed. A lot of businesses being funded both like that are game specific and non-game specific in terms of their application. That's exciting to unpack. So I think it'll be a while before we see the true long-term impact of that, and whether there are like game businesses that are truly directly tied to AI, or if it's just a toolkit that everybody leverages to do what they always did better. There's a lot of daylight in between the creation of a cool demo and like putting something in front of players that they really love. And so I don't think we have a company in our portfolio that's not playing with it and not looking for ways to get like mileage out of it. But I think your mileage will vary depending on what your actual plan is. If you're doing kind of 2D on mobile, like you'll probably be able to do more of your pipeline. Maybe not all the way to consumer touch, but more of it than if you're doing, kind of full 3D, like rigging, lighting, all this stuff that has to be accounted for in an environment that is a little bit less forgiving of, kind of kludging things together. This is one of the promises of the application of, kind of the tech and the methodology is that it will help map to, like the business challenges of running a great franchise, which are very much, kind of directly tied to how much content you can create. There's been, like other ways of getting around that particular challenge in the past, including, user-generated content and just straight up, big teams. But I think the promise of it is out there. I think you mentioned, kind of the death of UA, for example. I don't think it's the death. I think it is, kind of definitely a reshuffling of the deck. And so best practices that had kind of been accreted over many years, like wider understanding of like how LTV CPI arbitrage really works, like which was not broadly understood in the beginning of the free-to-play model. Like free-to-play economies and how to market them were not something that I think there was a very broadly understood playbook around the industry. I think mobile and free-to-play mobile really did a lot of heavy lifting to make that happen. And now some of that has been shuffled. And so, like what comes in its place is actually kind of exciting because I think it does create opportunities for other forms of distribution and content to, kind of slip in.
Is there like an area or a category therein that you're excited about or looking at without revealing your investment thesis fully?
Our secret sauce. I mean, we've been pretty public about kind of discussing that we view ourselves as an audience first fund, which is a bit of an esoteric concept unless you've been in the entertainment industry a long time, I guess. But most people who've built entertainment products understand that you have to care about your audience, and so it's not radical from that perspective. But like if you unpack that in the current environment, I think what you find is a bit of a return to normalcy in that like you have to make things that people love and care about and are willing to play for the joy of playing them. Not to say that kind of free to play games that like kind of were built on LTV CPR arbitrage don't do that, but it was a very nicely packaged opportunity for scale. And so like I think that's the part that like kind of is a bit of a question mark. It's like even if you can make something great, how do you scale it? I mean, you've spent a lot of time working with influencers, and so you probably know better than most that like that is a different kind of opportunity than just say like if I can get this kind of package right, then I can just buy my way up to a certain threshold. Working with like 100 influencers or 10,000, like it's a different challenge.
Absolutely.
And as you unpack that across all the different, like Discord, Reddit, TikTok, like all of these different, kind of organic communities that exist out there, not all of which are game specific. I think you kind of have a different marketing and publishing skill set to master.
Absolutely. I think a lot of companies struggle with creators because like they don't understand that when you get creators to talk about your game, like you're basically invited as a guest to their community.
Right.
So
exactly.
yeah, so the creators they have these fans because of the thing they do, because of the kind of connection they have with them. But then somebody comes in with this like UA mindset and says like, here's the creative, here's the thing, just just record this crap, and you're done. And the creator's offended if they do it. The audience is offended, the community is offended because like now you're a sellout, blah blah. So it really requires like a more human touch now.
Yeah. Yeah, which is in a way, like very healthy. I think respecting that, you are not the center of all of the discussions is a good perspective.
Yeah.
There are moments in the games industry I've noticed that we've been healthy, and then the minute somebody figures out a way to massive scale, everything shifts again.
Oh yeah.
And so I do expect that will happen once more. Like even if there is a period of, kind of great democracy and like equality for all. Like the minute somebody figures out an exploit, like that's definitely going to be a priority to learn. One of the most exciting things that's happened in the industry, and this is a slow thing, and it doesn't get as much headlines as a result, is that the demographic expansion has been incredibly impactful.
Yeah.
So whether you view that across generational lines, like every generation playing more games from basically, kind of Gen X on down, to the point that Gen Z is a gaming first generation, to, kind of the rise of female gamers, to the rise of international gamers, and just the penetration of devices and cloud technology, the opportunity space for games has changed.
Yeah.
And so, like when you see things like The Last of Us on HBO being one of the biggest shows in the history of that network, I think you're starting to see that, like the opportunity for gaming first IP is a lot bigger than it used to be. And so, like it's not just about, kind of selling boxes or even, like number of downloads and, how you calculate, kind of microtransaction revenue. It's also about, kind of the world building capability of some of these franchises is a lot bigger and more impactful than it used to be.
Yeah.
And the guys at Rovio and Remedy had the right idea. And so like to see it come to fruition now, I think is just, like their vision finally accomplished.
Yeah.
And I think the vanishing point, we're yet to see how far it goes. My dad, my whole life has run a nonprofit. And so, because of that, he and I have had a lifelong conversation around why can't games do more against something, from his perspective that matters. In that conversation and in most that I have with people in the industry, like I try and tease out the differences between like what, like commercial games that are very much oriented around return can do versus say like indie games or games that are like specifically targeted around an educational agenda. Depending on how much of an education agenda you want to bring to people's entertainment, you have kind of a bit of a harder time with it. It's hard enough to build a hit game, and kind of even without that like extra part of your agenda. And so like when you're trying to build a commercial success, like it's very hard, it's very competitive. And so if you want to layer on climate change, if you want to layer on kind of diversity, you want to layer on kind of social justice or kind of peace, kind of economic disparities, all of these are hard to communicate on any medium. And then to make it fun, which is arguably kind of one of the things that people expect when they play a game, is even harder. That said, like in the serious games world, you do see interesting examples of this. Unfortunately, you talk about games being this huge medium, those tend to break more niche. So like you'll see a game like Escape from Darfur where, like it's an amazing, kind of game. It does get the point across that, like this is basically a woman and her children trying to escape a war-torn area. And like that's a heavy subject to try and tackle in a video game. It's a heavy subject to try and tackle in a movie. But I think people are okay in a lean back format, kind of being exposed to a certain amount of like that kind of subject matter. In a game, because a lot of gameplay, not all of it, but can be very repetitive, it can be very recursive, it can feel like a lot to be exposed and hammered again and again and again with this type of message. That's the opportunity. But how far can you go before people walk away from it and just say like, oh boy, like that's just too much. I need to play something more fun now to get that out of my head. In individual decisions inside our companies, like we are supportive, like when they try and go down these vectors, but it's usually not inside the content.
Yeah.
It's usually inside, you know, like, hey, how are we doing hiring? How
Yeah.
are we behaving as a corporate entity? You know, like in our case, as a fund. And those are decisions that we can control and that don't really, you know, kind of have that kind of broad impact. But your question, I think, is the right one, which is, you know, like, how do you have that kind of impact? And I think it becomes, you know, like any content question, you know, like kind of quite detailed and quite difficult as you try and layer in, you know, like a clever character, an interesting message, you know, like teach a lesson. Like these are all, you know, kind of, I think, noble, but that much more difficult. I think you have to be very cognizant of what you're biting off when you go into each of those kind of design challenges, because they are, and you will get blowback, and you will get, you know, kind of, you know, featured on, you know, like various, you know, kind of discussions that you didn't intend. You know, when I was a producer on The Sims, we had, you know, kind of same-sex relationships, you know, like with the characters, and, you know, like that was controversial back then. And so, you know, like I think it's still controversial, frankly. And so, you know, like each one of those, you have to be, you know, like pretty prepared and, you know, kind of pretty aware of what you're doing. And that should be the case anyway. But you know, like I think it's definitely something that a lot of game producers, because we've never really been, you know, like front and center, you know, like in the public eye for, you know, creative decisions made in, you know, GTA, for example, you know, like The Sims, you know, like we're slowly, I think, learning, you know, kind of the true power of you know, the medium and the toolkit. And it is quite real. I mean, like, as you say, you know, like if you trace the design of a game like Last of Us, you can feel kind of the, you know, the intent of some of these systems and some of these characters. In that case, it's a little subtle, I would argue. But, you know, like you can kind of get the sense if you're looking for it. But, you know, like, are they teaching you, you know, like a great lesson about recycling or climate change? I don't know. You know, like I think most apocalyptic stories, you know, like basically are forcing you to confront, you know, kind of man's, you know, relationship with his environment. But, you know, like how much, you know, kind of preach do you want to throw in there?
Nice and tight ass after this city visit. Like 10,000 steps a day going up and down these hills.
What is the name of the bridge here? Which is designed by the same people?
It's actually built by the same people.
Yeah.
And you know what's even crazier?
What?
It's painted with the same paint.
No shit.
And what is the name of that paint?
Tell me.
International Red. Which sounds like communism, but it's actually a San Francisco-based company, so probably not.
What if we canceled the show today? This is actually the last episode. We couldn't save the game, sorry guys. But yeah, we'll see if we can save Lisbon.